In Russia, Leon Trotsky spends the 1920s leading the left opposition to Joseph Stalin's more bureaucratic version of Marxism. He is among the first members of the Politburo and founder and commander of the Red Army. In 1927, Joseph Stalin becomes head of state of the USSR and expels Trotsky from the Communist Party. Trotsky goes to Mexico. He opposes Stalin's non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler, and he and family members are assassinated on Stalin's orders.
In 1925, from Nashville, came the first radio broadcast of the Grand Ole Opry. George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue premieres in 1926. In 1928, penicillin was accidentally discovered by Alexander Fleming in England. It stopped the spread of bacteria. It opened the way for the world's first antibiotics and the first pharmaceutical industries. Women were allowed to compete for the first time in the Amsterdam Olympic Games. The first World Cup is played in 1931 in Uruguay. The first electronic television system is developed by Philo Farnsworth in 1927 in the United States.
Lee's parents, Charles Merritt and Mary Hoyt, lived until 1930. Charles was 78 when he died, living in the Saratoga Valley for 45 years. Mary Hoyt died 8 months later in the same year. She had been to Iowa to visit family and returned in good health and spirits. She was found unconscious in her room, the victim of a paralytic stroke. She was 75. On June 16, 1926, I married George Deegan Fryer.
At this time, I became Clara's second husband and stepfather to Keith Merritt, just as the Depression was beginning. Clara and I bought the movie theater in 1929. I ran the projector, and Clara did the bookwork. We sold it 3 years later, in 1932, to Reverend Arthur Campbell.
From 1929 to 1934, the world suffers an economic crisis. The Great Depression is sparked by a Wall Street crash in 1929. People overspeculate. Big players lose fortunes. Banks collapse. Loans are called in. It all contributes to mass unemployment. From 1930 to 31, over 3,000 banks fail in the United States alone. By 1932, 30% of the U.S. workforce is unemployed. There was no safety net. Welfare did not exist. Most affected were the industrialized areas of the world.
The Saratoga children were not very aware of the Depression for 2 reasons. One was that parents and grandparents were very planful about insulating them from the psychological depression that went with poverty. Just as they didn't talk about how rich they were, they didn't talk about being poor either. Your role in your family and your community did not depend entirely on how much money you had in your pocket. Actually, the West, Wyoming included, suffered less than the rest of the country because the timber and mining jobs were at their height during the Depression and were always important to the war efforts. Also, the townspeople were aware of government work projects. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps men, built the rock surround of the Saratoga Hot Pool, part of which still remains today.
We do not know a great deal about Keith's early school years other than that he had large dreams to move on from Saratoga. Keith's son, George Richard, in the early 1990s, did talk to a man he met through work who knew Keith during those years. He said that Keith was the brightest person he ever knew, and in many ways that worked against him, as he was often bored in school. However, he was not prone to acting out.
I was postmistress until I retired in 1935. That year, my second husband, George Fryer, and I built and opened a Sinclair gas service station business on December 1, 1935. I took up the bookkeeping for the station and helped with the customers.
After Clara and I built the station in Saratoga, We all worked there. Keith worked at the station all through his later school years. Keith was able to oversee activities at the station and at home. And Clara and I in the winters would go either to California or Florida to the races. We also had family to visit and enjoyed going and seeing them.
We bought the Hood House on September 14, 1934, and the Tiltons, the previous owner's furniture, came with it. There was also some sheet music I added to my extensive collection. I rented rooms to school teachers. I came to Saratoga as a school teacher, and I was glad to rent to them and make a little money at the same time. They rented the upstairs rooms, and George and I lived downstairs. After a few years, the house was called the Friar House by the people in town.
In the summer of 1935, when he was 13, Keith went with me on a gold dredging trip to Atlantic City, Wyoming. There were several men and 3 kids, including Keith, on the trip. The other kids slept in a tent, and Keith slept in the car. This was not a wildly successful trip. In 1938, I found 2 orphan bear cubs in the mountains. I brought the cubs to the station, built an enclosure to keep them in, used them to